watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Welcome to another in our series, Jewish 101, a series for anyone interested in all things Jewish, beginning with an understanding of the Jewish tradition. I'm Mark Golub, and so it's time to talk about what might very well be described as the most important event in all of Western civilization, certainly the most important event in the history of the Jewish people. That moment when the children of Israel, all of them who had 7 weeks earlier, placed the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their home, the night of the 10th plague in Egypt, the night of the Passover, when God saw which of the Israelite families, and according to the Midrash, which Egyptian families wished to leave Egypt and all that it stood for the sake of a vision of what a life of holiness, a life of sacredness and divine commitment, what each human being could then make of each other by beginning a journey together, not simply through the Sinai desert, but through history and time, on a journey together, bound with a sacred purpose to make this world more in harmony with the divine, a world in which every stranger would be treated as the homeborn, a world in which no one would ever put a stumbling block before the blind or would even think to curse the deaf, a world where slander and gossip would be unacceptable, and where the orphan and the widow and the homeless and the hungry and the needy and the aged and the lonely would be held in warm embrace, to fear no sense of isolation or persecution or injustice. A world where every form of physical and emotional slavery would be abolished, where people would be their brother's keeper and their sister's keeper and their child's keeper and their parents' keeper, knowing that whatever one experiences as pain oneself, whatever pain one experiences, one should never inflict on another human being, but that every man, woman, and child should love one's fellow human as oneself, and where every child, woman, and man would sit beneath their own vine and their own fig tree, with no one to make them ever afraid. That is the moment we have reached in our studies together. It is the moment called Sinai, where the children of Israel stood as one to receive the most precious gift in this world, the gift of the Torah. And I have here just a miniature Torah. Torah I once gave to my daughter at the top of Mitzvah in Israel, and then she read from this very Torah the very passage, her Maftirah passage that she had read to become a bat mitzvah. And once a year, on the holiday of Shavuot, or Shavuos, to those of us who were raised in the Ashkenazic dialect, on the annual festival of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, the Jewish people relive that moment at Sinai, when we receive the gift of Torah. This day, we are still standing again together at Sinai to receive the Torah. And if I could see each one of you right now, somehow through this television camera I'm looking at, and I could see you watching on your television screen, if I could see you, I'm sure I'd recognize you from that time together, that moment together, when we stood as one together at Sinai. Then, just as we're standing together at Sinai now, anyone who wanted to become part of the Jewish people, anyone who wants to become part of the Jewish people and this Jewish journey through time, then or now, you were at Sinai. You can stand at Sinai today to join in this exhilarating, exhausting, thrilling, divinely important journey, to be part of a family, a people committed to making this world a reflection of the divine and a place where the Shekhinah, God's presence, can dwell. So we talk about Sinai and what it means to the Jewish tradition, what the rabbis understood Sinai to be. And by now, if you've been with me for any length of time at all, you know that what the rabbis teach about Sinai, how the sages of our great Jewish tradition understood that moment to be, is very different from the simple Hebrew school storybook version of these events that most of us were taught as children in Hebrew school. And by the way, before we actually look at the story, I want to ask you, how would you immediately answer, answer immediately, these two simple questions? Who was the first Jew? How would you answer that question? Right away, who was the first Jew? And answer this question for me too. Where was Moses when God gave the Ten Commandments, the Torah? Where was Moses? Who was the first Jew, and where was Moses when God gave the Ten Commandments? So let's first go to the simple story. Let's get it out of the way. Here's the story. It goes like this. And you'll see if this story sounds familiar to you. The children of Israel arrive at Mount Sinai. Moses goes up to the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, where God gives Moses the Ten Commandments on 2 tablets of stone for an entire generation. The picture we have of Moses is that of a bearded Charlton Heston, where it turns to the children of Israel with these 2 tablets that he cradles in his arms, and which he ultimately gives to the children of Israel. And in general, that's the story most people are taught about Mount Sinai and the giving of the Ten Commandments. And as you might guess, and as those of you who are familiar with the Midrash to the Sinai story, the rabbinic commentary that tells what really happened at Sinai, the Midrash, has so much, much more to it. Expands what this event meant, this moment of cosmic importance, divine importance, which changed human thinking and human behavior forever. So now let's look at the real story of Sinai. So you'll remember 1 week after their exodus from Egypt, the children of Israel survived the Red Sea after this Nachshon ben Aminadav moves forward in response to his sense of God, and the Red Sea splits. Nachshon jumps into the water. And the children of Israel, tribe by tribe, each through a separate pathway, cross safely through the Red Sea. And as one people again walk on for another 6 weeks, and after a total of 7 weeks, the children of Israel arrive at what the Midrash describes as a very modest hill, which appeared in the distance to look like a beautiful mound of cheese, the delicacy of cheese, which is why many Jewish communities eat cheese to celebrate the holiday of Shavuot. And why was it a modest hill? Because ultimately that's where God would reveal the law. And one didn't need, the Midrash tells us, it to be some exalted place, because one can find God even in a burning bush and in a modest hill. And in the Torah, the book of Exodus, chapter 19, when the children of Israel arrive at Mount Sinai, God calls Moses up the mountain, and Moses is told by God to prepare the people for 2 days in anticipation of God's speaking to them. For on the 3rd day, God will come down in the sight of all the people. And God warns Moses to set boundaries around the base of the mountain so that no Israelite would come up upon it. And Moses did as God had told him. He returned down the mountain and led the people in 2 days of preparation. And every Israelite washed his garments to be fresh and clean. And you may remember, if you can see yourselves back at that time, or you can surely imagine, the sense of excitement permeating the entire encampment of the children of Israel, mixed with a sense of awe and fright that comes from being in the presence of the awesome, most awesome God, God's self, would be descending upon the mount for all of us to see. What would that moment be like when God descends on the mount right before us? How would we survive being in the presence of God? It would be thrilling and frightening and exciting all at once. And I remember talking to my wife Ruth about how excited I was and how excited she was. And I asked her, how did she feel? Was she frightened? And I was so glad that I was there with my brother David and his family. And my parents were there. My grandparents were there. My aunts and uncle were there. My cousins. And some of the best friends I now have, they were all there this day. Every one of us. Just as I'm sure every one of you who were there that day, this day at Sinai. We all were filled with such anticipation. We could hardly breathe, hardly move. You remember? And then it was the 3rd day. And we put on our clean garments. Oh, the excitement. And we left our tents. And we moved together in this great sea of fellow Israelites toward the base of the mountain, knowing we must never cross the boundary. And the mountain was engulfed in thunder and lightning. And there was a thick cloud upon the mount, and it was altogether in smoke, and the mount quaked. And remember, we could hear the shofar, the ram's horn, being blown so loud. We'd never heard the shofar blown so loudly, confirming this sacred, transforming moment of Sinai. And over all the sound, above the thunder, above the call of the shofar, we heard the voice of Moses calling to God. And though we could not hear, we knew that Moses heard the call of God in return. And then that courageous, amazing human being who had led us out of Egyptian bondage and shepherded us through 7 weeks of journey to this mountain. It was difficult at times. We kvetched, we complained. He never wavered. This remarkable human being, this extraordinary presence a magnificent leader. We saw him move forward toward the mountain, past the boundary, to meet with God, God's self. The Torah describes the moment. God Yarad, descended upon Mount Sinai, and Moses Ya'al, went up the mount. The divine and the human partner, each moving towards each other. The genius of the text, God had to come down. Note the brilliant poetry of the Torah. God Yarad descended to meet the soul of Adam, the man. But the man had to Ya'al, ascend in spirit, in vision, to meet with the divine. And what happened next? Most people will tell you that God then gave Moses the law. And by law they mean either the Ten Commandments, or by law they mean the entire Torah. But most people will tell you that this is when God gave the law to Moses, so that he could bring it down to the people, the children of Israel, to us, waiting in awe at the foot of the mountain. That's what most people will tell you, but no. That's not what happens in the Torah text, nor is it what happens in the wondrous Midrash. For in the Jewish tradition, no single human being, not even Moses, gets the Torah first. No person receives the Torah first and then hands it to the rest of us. There is no such intermediary in the Jewish tradition. The Midrash tells us the entire story. And so it is that when Moses meets with God on the mountain, Moses is eager to tell God that he's prepared the people as God had instructed him. Okay, says God, now go back down so I can give the Torah to the children of Israel. What? Says Moses. I thought you'd want me up here too when you speak to the children of Israel. I want to be close to you. No, God says. You've got to go down and stand with them as one of them. Lest anyone think the Torah comes from you, or that somehow you are more important than they are, or are closer to the Torah than is anyone of the rest of the people. And in the Midrash, Moses says everything he can think of, gives every argument he can think of to convince God to let him stay on the mountain when God speaks to the children of Israel. And in the Midrash, it's as if God realizes that Moses, perhaps out of his own ego, perhaps out of spiritual fervor that has marred his rational thinking, Moses is simply not going to be convinced by any argument. So in the Midrash, God devises a ruse and tells Moses in verse 24 of chapter 19 of the book of Exodus, go back down the mountain, and you will then come up with your brother Aaron. But be sure not to let any of the priests or any of the people come up with you. And chapter 19 ends with verse 25, and it reads like this. So Moses went down unto the people and told them. And the moment Moses returned to the bottom of the mount, we read verse 1 of chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. Chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. If possible, It's hard to remember all the chapters and what each chapter contains, but if possible, try to remember that chapter number, chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. For in verse 1 of Exodus chapter 20, with Moses at the bottom of the mount, standing as another of the children of Israel, standing with us, we read, and God spoke all these words, saying, and beginning with the next verse, we have the first of the 10 Commandments. I am Adonai thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Unlike the story so many of us were taught, when the 10 Commandments were given in the text, where was Moses? He was not on the top of the mountain. He was not on the top of the mountain. Religious school textbook pictures notwithstanding. Symbolically, poetically, he was no closer to God than any other Israelite. When the 10 Commandments were actually given, the commandments which symbolize all the commandments of Torah, Moses was just another Israelite at the bottom of the mount with all of us. That's where he was when the Torah was given to all of us at Sinai. And this is a crucial Jewish notion. While Moses is revered in the Jewish tradition as the greatest prophet who ever lived, the dominant, overwhelming figure, not only in the Torah text, but in all of Judaism, Moses, the only prophet whom Adonai knew, panim el panim, face to face. Moses, the great Rav, the great teacher of Torah, which is why the Jewish tradition doesn't refer to Moses as a prophet, but refers to Moses in reverent love as Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses, our teacher, our ultimate rabbi. And the Torah is even called the 5 books of Moses, not only for his role in the story from the second book of the Torah on, but for his role in helping us understand the meaning of Torah. But as honored and revered as Moses is in the Jewish tradition, the rabbis consciously went out of their way to be sure we, the Jewish people, never canonized Moses, never made a saint out of Moses, never suggested he could serve as an intermediary between Jews and God, as if Jews could pray to Moses and then Moses would take a Jew's prayer to the Holy One, blessed be he. You know, at the end of the Torah, the last event described is Moses' death and his burial in the valley of the land of Moab. And then the Torah specifically states, and no one knows where Moses is buried to this day. The rabbis ask, why don't we know where Moses is buried? Why was it so important for the Torah to specify we don't know where Moses is buried to this day? After all, our tradition tells us where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah are buried. In the cave of Machpelah in Eretz Yisrael. We know where Rachel is buried, in Rachel's tomb, also in Eretz Yisrael. But we don't know where Moses is buried. Why? The rabbis answer, it's to teach us that we may not make a shrine out of Moses' tomb. For Moses was, despite his extraordinary, unique greatness, and despite his unique relationship with God, Moses was still no more than a mortal human being with his own Yetzer Hara, considerable Yetzer Hara, his own ego, his own angers, his own frustrations, his own ghosts, as well as his enormous patience and compassion for the children of Israel. Yetzer Tov. And so it had to be that when God spoke the 10 Commandments, the Torah, to the children of Israel, Moses had to be standing simply as one of them, among them, with us. He couldn't be up on the mountain. And it was time, that day, this day, Shavuot, for us, the children of Israel, to hear and to receive the Torah. Do you remember what that moment was like? The Midrash will remind you. Amidst the thunder and the lightning and the fire and the smoke, and after that great blast of the shofar, there was absolute silence. Total silence. The entire universe became utterly still. The wind was still. No branch moved. No leaf fell. No bird flapped its wing in flight. No cow mooed. No horse neighed. Even the flies stopped buzzing around throughout the world, so that no ox needed swish its tail. Absolute silence. And you remember the language in which God spoke to us that moment, this day, on that first Shavuot. We know the language the Torah is written in. It's written in Hebrew. But do you remember which language did God give the Torah when God spoke at Sinai? The Midrash reminds us. At one and the same time, God gave the Torah in every language. The number the Midrash uses is 70 to express this idea of every language. For in the Jewish tradition, God does not give the Torah in Hebrew alone. Why? Because the Jewish tradition teaches the Torah is given to everyone, to anyone who wishes to hear the Torah, who can hear it. The rabbi's notion is the Torah is given to everyone. And so the Torah had to be spoken by God in everyone's language at one and the same time. So no one could ever say, I didn't accept the Torah because I couldn't hear it or understand it. It wasn't in my language. No. The Torah is for anyone who wishes to cleave to its teachings, to its paths of peace. And so in the Midrash, the Torah was given in every language at one and the same time. And according to the Jewish tradition, when the Torah is read in public in Hebrew, it is to be read with a translator present, a maturgaman, who translates the Hebrew into the vernacular language spoken in that community, lest someone who doesn't know Hebrew feel left out, be left out, would be unable to embrace the words, the meaning of Torah. And the Midrash, the rabbinic genius, goes still further. Amazing. For God did not only give the Torah in every language. According to the Midrash, the Jewish tradition, God gave the Torah in such a way that every individual, each one of us, could understand it in his or her own way, through his or her own temperament and learning style and strength of mind and heart. And this Midrash is just amazing in its far-reaching understanding of human beings and the way each human being learns and assimilates information and relates to the world around us. So that according to the rabbis, if an individual, for example, had a poetic soul, the Torah would be heard by that individual, given to that individual as poetry. If another individual was very scientific, mathematical, he would hear the Torah, it would be given to him in those terms. You know, today we talk about people who are either right brain or left brain oriented in their learning. The Midrash already appreciated this, saying that each individual heard the Torah in a way that made it most understandable and most embraceable, most learnable for each of them. And this is such an important rabbinic insight into the meaning of what Torah truly is. And you know, so many people have heard how I've explained that the Torah is poetry, how Maimonides says it's parable, and that the rabbis never meant it to be read literally. This Midrash helps explain how the Torah is not a literal text, limited to a literal meaning. If everyone hears it differently, it can't be a literal text. Human imagination, human genius finds layers and layers of different meaning in the Torah text. We all begin with the same text, but the rabbis teach us that individuals hear it, read it, understand it differently. And the rabbis say to us, the rabbis, each generation has the right to find its own understanding of Torah and of God. Each generation learns anew in its own way. That's an amazing thing for the rabbis to teach. Each generation, the Jewish tradition teaches us, the rabbis teach us, learns it anew in their own terms. There's this wonderful midrash that says, why is the prayer book have the line, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? Why couldn't the Hebrew have simply said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why did the term God have to be repeated each time? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob? And the rabbis answer, Hebrew grammar aside, the rabbis answer, they use this to do a drash to help us understand our own Jewish tradition. The rabbis teach us it's because the generation of Isaac did not understand God the way that Abraham or Jacob understood God. And the generation of Jacob did not understand God the way Isaac or Abraham's generation had understood it. And Abraham's understanding was not the understanding of Isaac and Jacob, because each generation works it out for themselves, but it's the same God. How do you know? Because ultimately, each generation stands at Sinai once a year to celebrate Shavuot. Because they carry the same Torah with them that demands of them a sense of decency, where the other person's dignity is respected. The Jewish tradition tells us to be lovely, gentle, wonderful, loving people who eat matzah on Passover and dwell in the sukkah on Sukkot. And while each generation understood God in its own way, it was the same Torah and the same God whom they heard in terms of what they did and how they lived. We each heard the Torah spoken by God that day, this day, on the first Shavuot and on every Shavuot, by which we relive that moment together. But there's more to the story. Of course there's more. And I ask you this question, what really happened at Sinai? What did God actually say? What did God actually give us? And by the way, many of you have asked me in your own emails what my personal view of the Torah is and God's relationship to the Torah. Do I believe that God actually wrote the Torah? How do I distinguish between different passages of the Torah? All of these questions, in essence, come out of this one question: what really happened at Sinai, that first Shavuot? And the way in which different Jews answer that question will explain to you why there are different expressions and different movements of Judaism, and why there have always been many movements of Judaism and differing understandings of Torah throughout Jewish history to this day. And perhaps most important is for us each to realize and understand that the Jewish tradition itself has more than one answer to the question: what really happened at Sinai? What does it mean to say that at Sinai, God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, and that the Jewish people received it? And what was our response then, when we each heard the Torah spoken personally to us? And how does each of us respond today, still, to that moment, Sinai? These are some of the questions we'll address next time as we continue to explore the Jewish tradition's account of what we experienced at Sinai. I hope you'll join me. And as always, I ask you to please be in touch with me this week with any thoughts or questions you might have to this episode of Jewish 101. I love hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.